Good afternoon and welcome to the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture online. I'm David DeSerto, Interim Executive Director. The Sheen Center is an initiative of the Archdiocese of New York to engage, elevate, and evangelize culture. And today's conversation is part of our ongoing free public content that we're offering online while we can't gather together in person down at the Sheen Center. If you haven't done so already, I please like us on Facebook, subscribe to our Sheen Talks YouTube channel, and click that bell icon for notifications of future videos. Today, we are delighted to be joined and spend some time with composer Kevin Allen, who joins us from Chicago to talk about classical music and finding God in that classical music. So, Kevin, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today. As we were talking about before the stream, I came across you and your music a while ago, and I immediately knew this was someone that we had to have here at the Sheen Center, even if just virtually. So it's a real honor to have you with us today.
I'm so happy you asked me to be a part of it.
Oh, well, the honor is all ours. You know, thinking about classical music, I was blessed and fortunate enough to grow up in a home where, you know, a sort of a baseline appreciation for classical music was encouraged and fostered as part of a sort of a fully formed, you know, life. But if I'm going to be honest, I think my first introduction to classical music, like many people, was Bugs Bunny. It was Looney Tunes. And, you know, say what you want about those Looney Tunes, it did certainly expose generations of children to, you know, works by Beethoven and Wagner and Strauss before I ever knew who any of those people were. So I guess my first question to you is, what was your introduction to classical music? If you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you felt that, if I could call it that, because I think it is a vocation, to composing and conducting music.
Well, sure. My first music teacher, who I had actually for the first 9 years of my schooling, Sister Lorraine of the School Sisters of St. Francis, introduced us to just general music and also singing in the choir. And so immediately, I don't know, I shouldn't say immediately, but shortly thereafter, I thought about, you know, putting notes together of my own and writing my own music. And I continued doing that. And I think I probably firmly decided in middle adolescence that this is what I would do for the rest of my life.
Wow. Was there a moment when I mean, obviously there are many people out there who you know, are musically inclined and you know, play around with some compositions, but I mean, you are a composer on sort of a world-class level. I mean, you are a very talented composer. Was there a moment when you knew this is not something that I just love, but something that I am going to do as a career?
Oh, absolutely. I think really fairly early on, because I was able to compose these pieces and hear them immediately because I exposed my classmates to them and kind of forced them to perform them. And so I received such positive feedback from my peers, but also my teachers. So I was fairly certain, even by the age of 16, 17.
Well, we'll certainly get into some of your works in a moment, and we'll unpack that a little bit more. But maybe to start off with some broader questions, you know, while classical music certainly has a very devoted fan base, several recent polls seem to suggest that many people feel that, you know, classical music is, you know, they're always saying is on the decline, that is out of step with contemporary tastes. You know, for those people who would say classical music is not for me, what would you say as to why classical music is still important and relevant and should be part of everyone's listening?
Well, I think both statements that you made are absolutely true. It is certainly out of step with our modern culture. First of all, for the United States, classical music is an import from Europe. I mean, it's basically European music, which we've adopted, and we've adopted so many things from Europe because, you know, the settlers of this country, you know, came from Europe. So it's understandable that we would bring things over and then, you know, broaden them or add our own flavor to them. But classical music actually, as a living form, as a popular form, is not only not possible here in the United States, but it's also not really in Europe either. I mean, popular music, which is an American import, has really dominated the musical scene, the popular musical scene throughout the whole world. But the reason why I think it's important still is because classical music is absolutely integrated with the foundation of Western civilization. So it's along with philosophy and architecture and applied art. So to really understand where we are and who we are, we really should see the foundation of how this culture began, and well, to see how it's going to continue.
Interesting. And we'll certainly get into a little bit of that a little bit later, because I want to make some connections between the musical art forms and some other art forms. But then there's another group of people, and I guess to a certain extent, I would even be in that camp, where they certainly want that appreciation of classical music for that, in addition to the cultural understanding, just for the enjoyment of it. And they realize that there is beauty there, there's importance there, but maybe they're a little intimidated, or they feel ill-equipped or overwhelmed. There's just so much out there. You know, what would you suggest to that person, you know, watching this today, who wants to sort of educate themselves in classical music? What some beginning steps might be, where to start? What advice would you give them, some practical advice?
I would say today there's certainly far more resources than there ever were. I mean, in the past, people solely had to depend on recordings if they couldn't afford to, you know, go to concerts, you know, at the symphony or the opera. But now, you know, with the internet and YouTube, I mean, the music's just really at everyone's fingertips, and much of it, you know, available without much of a financial investment. So it makes it easy on that score. But also by that same convenience of being able to research on our own, I would suggest that to those that would like to explore classical music or to find a deeper appreciation of it, is to, you know, find some connection. For instance, if you have a particular, you know, love for a certain country or a certain culture or a certain period in time, or for instance, you're in a major city and you want to know, you know, who are the composers that were native to your city or your country. I mean, start somewhere where there's a connection outside of the music, where you can, you know, have a bond with those composers, and then listen to it. I mean, go to the free concerts. There's so many free concerts, not so many these days, but in general, free concerts are an easy way, and I think you can learn as much about your taste for classical music by hearing something that you don't like. You know, it's like, well, I certainly don't like this music, so, you know, just it's an easy
process of elimination.
Exactly. And actually really informs, you know, I think this gives you a lot of information on you know, your tastes. And I think you'll also find some gems that you would never have expected that way.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, the advantage of, you know, living in this digital age, as you said, is it's really at our fingertips, where we could really experience, at least, you know, the not the live experience, but, you know, listening to the music. Many of your compositions, although certainly not all of them, are sacred liturgical pieces. Can you talk a little bit about the traditional role that music plays in liturgy, and how music can often, you know, deepen that spiritual experience?
Well, first, our liturgy is absolutely, from beginning to end, a sung liturgy. I mean, everything is sung except the sermon, and occasionally, like for instance in the Triduum, a few prayers that are actually said. So the Mass, at least in its most traditional form, from beginning to end, is music. Actually, it's something's chanted. The Gospel's chanted. All the readings are chanted. The propers of the Mass are chanted. Of course, the Ordinary, the Kyrie, Gloria, etc., are chanted. And so the only thing that's really spoken is the sermon. Even the responses, you know, et cum spiritu tuo and the amens are all sung. So from the very existence, the very beginning of our liturgy, it starts with music. And over time, composers have, you know, elaborated and made it more appealing, you know, depending on the time and the place that they are. We began with just Gregorian chant, and after Gregorian chant, polyphony. And so now we not only have, you know, chant Kyries, but polyphonic Kyries, and even masses with orchestra. So music is integrally bound with the Mass, and depending on where you are, where you live, every nation has put their own touch to the liturgy. So and their own spirituality as well. And so now, because we're in this great age, we talked about the digital age, we can tap into any of those. Let's see, what was the devotion in France in the 17th century? And you can listen to music in the 17th century. And so you can find, what speaks to you. But one thing is for sure, in every age, the Holy Spirit has made it possible for everyone to pray in a way that's unique to them, but what was still retaining the foundation of the faith.
Speaking of faith, obviously, your Catholic faith, as any Catholic artist, the faith influences their work. How has your own Catholic faith influenced your work as a composer, and how has music influenced your faith? So I guess it's, both sort of influence the other.
They do, and there's an ebb and flow between the two. As you grow deeper in your faith and your understanding, one hopes it coincides with your experience as an artist as you grow in your craft. And so I find that the more understanding, the more reading, the more study that you get, and the more sermons and spiritual teaching that you have, and spiritual exercises that you go through year in and year out, will deepen your faith and give you a different understanding of those same texts that you may have set, many, many times before. And when you think about writing the Mass, composing a setting of the Mass, I've composed, several settings, close to 20, 25 settings of the Mass. And each time that you write these same words, because you have grown in this way, it causes your approach to be a little different, and I would hope a little deeper.
Interesting. Do you see the act of writing your music almost a form of prayer for you?
Absolutely. I'm not sure exactly when I started doing this, but I remember reading about art history. I mean, reading a lot of art history, and reading how the iconographers write icons. And there were certain prayers and preparations that they would do, as they were mixing their paint and preparing the board for the icon. And I thought, well, I should try that with music. And so I started these preparatory prayers and composing music the way the great writers of icons wrote their icons. So it's you enter into this creative process with prayer, because you are composing prayers, and just as the icon writers are writing prayer.
And it's interesting that you bring up that comparison of the icons, because the icons are images that point beyond themselves. Right. And I assume when you hear great liturgical music, on one level, it's just the beauty of the sounds, but it's also the way that it points beyond itself. It points to something transcendent. We actually are fortunate to have one of your works that we're gonna show now. It is the Hodie Chiastis. And perhaps before we cut to that, if you could just briefly set it up, and then we'll talk a little bit about it after we listen. It's about a 3-minute piece. Yes,
this Hodie Chiastis is a 4-part piece, a cappella piece, unaccompanied for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass voices. And it is taken from the Vigil of the Nativity. The text is actually from the introit and the gradual. It could actually be sung as an introit if you insert the psalm and the Gloria Patri afterward.
Beautiful. Let's take a look and a listen. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
You know, you hear something like that, and you think of St. Augustine's great line that, you know, when you sing, you pray twice, and it's so evident in when you hear a beautiful piece like that. Can you walk us through what the process is for creating a piece of music like that, and particularly, you know, with a piece like that, the goal is not just to create something that is pleasing to the ear, although it certainly is, but it is in itself an act of worship and praise. So I assume that adds another layer of not only difficulty, but I would almost say a certain sense of responsibility that when you're crafting something like that.
Sure. My process is very mundane, very ordinary. I get up and put on a pot of coffee, and I sit at my desk, and I go to work.
You're ruining the mystique of the artist here.
Totally, because there's no mystique. It's just really work. It's wonderful work. It's beautiful work, but it is quite ordinary. I read the text. I read the text over and over. To get the rhythm of the text in my head, the rhythm of the words. And at that point, usually after a few readings, some sort of theme comes to mind. Now, that, at least for this particular piece, that was the process, and is often the process for me, for motets. Sometimes if you're using, you know, a cantus firmus or given melody, that already gives you a structure in which to compose the piece. Also, depending on where the piece goes in the liturgy, that also has an influence on how it's approached. For instance, if this was going to be sung as an introit, you realize that this is the very beginning of Mass, and so you're writing to kind of set the pace for the coming liturgy, the liturgy that will happen afterward. So, but even if I'm thinking of writing an introit, the piece has to be able to function in other ways as well. For instance, if you want to sing it as an offertory motet or as a communion motet, and I don't think there's a conflict there, but at least I have a starting point, and it gives me a structure in which to base the piece.
And I assume, does that same process work whether you're writing a liturgical piece or whether you're writing just a composition of a symphonic piece? I assume it's the same type of process?
Absolutely. Perhaps, at least for me, it's maybe easier. That particular how to begin, you know, how to set the tone for the piece is probably a little simpler for an orchestral piece or an opera, for instance, because everyone knows, you know, an opera, you're sitting there, people are sitting there waiting for the opera to begin. So, or if you're writing the overture. But with a liturgical piece, if it's a piece for communion or a piece, or if it's a Gloria, those are two totally different places to begin. And so with a symphony, you know, people are sitting down and the orchestra's in front of them. So it's rather straightforward, I think, for mundane or for secular music as opposed to sacred music, because usually there's a liturgical function and the piece should really fit the function.
You know, it's interesting. You talk in both regards. You talk about that pacing, that placement. In that piece in particularly, the title of the event today is you know, the silence in between, and a lot of the most powerful moments of silence of music are those moments of silence, whether it's the silence during a liturgy or the silence during a symphonic piece, and that's almost often where you have those moments of illumination or inspiration. Do you often find that sometimes when you're writing music, you find those, it's, for lack of a better word, that it's almost God is in the silence. You know, you write the music around it, and then you allow the silence to happen for those encounters, those sort of encounters with mystery, those encounters with the transcendent. Is that, am I onto something there, or is?
I think so, and there are several different ways in which that can happen. Sometimes they happen organically. You know, you're composing a piece, and suddenly, because of the themes that you're using to weave in and out of the various voice parts, suddenly that silence, or whether it's silence of a rest or just the punctuation of the text, they come in very surprising and beautiful ways. But sometimes they can be planned. for a great effect, and it fulfills the same function. For instance, in the offertory, I think of my five-voice Requiem Mass, there's a moment where it's a significator Sanctus Michael, let Michael, the standard bearer, and it's a call to Saint Michael. And so the choir sings, Saint Michael, come to us. And then there's this long rest, as the voices echo, and as if to say, are you coming? Are you here yet? And then they sing it again. And so that's a very powerful, very planned and structural element, which fulfills the same function.
Yeah, it's a use of silence as almost like a musical instrument of sorts. It's in, and obviously I should say that that phrase, the silence in between, comes from Beethoven. And in seeing that phrase, it actually reminded me of the great Catholic novelist Flannery O'Connor. And she worked with words as where musicians work with sounds and notes. And there's a line from her describing Christ as that ragged figure that moves in the background from tree to tree. And you could almost say that, Christ is that presence that moves from note to note in music. It's always present, even when it's not, in the forefront. What is it about music that speaks so powerfully when even words can't? It speaks to the soul in a way, and obviously, as you said, all cultures have different forms of music. But we're speaking specifically here about classical or liturgical music. There's a sublime quality there that speaks the language of beauty and mystery in a way that often words fail at accomplishing that.
I agree. I think music really has a way that's very present. I mean, it's an audible art, and poetry is as well. But reading poetry, so Gerald Manley Hopkins, if you were an English speaker, you could hear that poetry and be moved by it. But let's say, for instance, if you're reading Goethe, for instance, and you don't understand German, it won't really have that same powerful effect. Whereas music, even if you don't understand the words, you can get a sense of what the composer is saying. You can listen to a great opera of Verdi or Puccini, and if you can't understand Italian at all, or if you are an Italian speaker and you can't understand just because singing sometimes muddles the words, you can still get the force, the pleasure, the power of that music, regardless of the language. And the other arts are also powerful in their own way, but in this way, music, I think, has the upper hand, even over poetry and literature, which also can be an audible art, because at least literature, has the language, and music, of course, you can have just the sound and still have the power behind it. Yeah,
I totally agree. Speaking of the power of music, again, to sort of weave in another art form, a visual art form, film, the great Swedish director Ingmar Bergman once said that art lost its power when it's separated from worship. Now, musically speaking, do you agree that there's a truth to that? Let me just leave it with that for a moment, and then we'll do a follow-up question.
Well, I agree and disagree. I'm actually, I know Ingmar Bergman's work very well. Actually, one of my favorite films of all time is his Wild Strawberries. When people ask, well, what's your favorite movie? It's Bergman's Wild Strawberries. So I'm very, very familiar with his work. But I agree with him and disagree. When it loses its power of worship, of course, there's all kinds of worship. And I would agree with him if he said the worship of the triune God. I would insert that and then be in full agreement with him, because art has great power, and music can have great power, and there's all kinds of worship. So I think there has been a negative element, in liturgical, and actually in other arts as well, where it's not life affirming, it's not speaking to the glory and praise of God, and it has a destructive force. So I do agree with him in the sense that when it's absent from worship of the triune God, then yes, absolutely. But we do know that there are those forces that are working, in art, but not really for the glorification of God.
Sure. So music has a sort of an innate power, and how is it harnessed towards the good, or is it harnessed towards something that works against the good, whether it's architecture or poetry, or in this case, music, particularly liturgical music. It just elevates the soul. It makes the religious experience so much fuller and deeper. But I guess the corollary to that is, do you think that a lot of modern music, particularly modern liturgical music, modern liturgical architecture either, is actually, for lack of a better word, eroding the sense of the sacred, eroding the ability to sort of tune our hearts to that transcendent reality that is God?
Perhaps that has always been the case to greater and lesser degrees, throughout history. But we can certainly point to a time, in this century where it seems to be really, really on the rise, you could say. But I'm also seeing a number of young people, students, when I go to workshops or when I'm teaching at workshops, that are really trying to rebuild. And I think we are in a time of rebuilding in a certain segment, of the church and also of society, that people can see the errors of things that were happening at the beginning of the century and trying to turn them around. So I think there's both, but I think there's hope. I see some new young musicians that are really aiming to do some very, very good things.
Well, that's perfect. Again, a perfect segue, because in looking at some lists, I am not very familiar with a lot of more modern classical composers. Obviously, yourself, and another name that comes to mind often is the Catholic Scottish composer Sir James Macmillan, who's phenomenally talented. But in going through some lists that it went to this New York Times listing of modern classical composers, and there's some interesting work being done. But again, I'm not an expert, but in going through the list, there didn't seem to be a lot of Mozarts or Beethovens in the mix. Now, maybe I'm just not familiar with them, and I'm happy to hear that you're saying that there are a lot of young, talented musicians kind of emerging. Are there any young musicians that we should know about, and that these are people who are doing some really wonderful work?
Well, I must say I'm really relieved that you didn't find any Mozarts or Beethovens in the list, because those men have been dead for such a long time, and they should rest in peace. But that does point to an issue that perhaps happens in other places, but I know for sure it happens in this country, is that we have this kind of artistic complex of inferiority, where we're looking to the past always, not as a foundation and not as a stepping stone to new things, but looking to the past, and wanting to stay there, and not moving forward. It's a bit insulting. Actually, it's insulting to God, because it's saying that the Holy Ghost worked in the 16th century and then he stopped. And how can we say that? God works in his people in every time, in every place. So to look for a Mozart or Beethoven is probably not correct. Actually, it is not correct. You should be looking for an Ostrowski or an Allen instead, or Macmillan. So the place to go to your churches, and if you're not hearing music, ask the director. Why are you only programming Palestrina? Palestrina is lovely. He spoke in his time and in this place. It's not to say we can't ever do him again, but he worked in Italy. Find out who's working in New York. Find out who's working in Chicago. I don't think it's correct to wait for this to be placed, in our laps. I think we should do some work also, and ask our pastors and ask our music directors, why aren't you doing, music that is worthy of Catholic worship, but also is not 100 years old? How about doing something 10 minutes old?
How do we do that? I mean, if there are some young aspiring composers listening to you today, I think of the words of either Chesterton or Cardinal Newman, who talked about tradition is exactly what you're saying. It's retaining what is of value, but also, growing with those roots. So how do we retain the patrimony of beauty that the church has, but also speak those timeless truths musically in new and innovative ways? I mean, you're right. We are compared to European ancestors, are a relatively young country with many rich influences, whether it's the beautiful growing Spanish-speaking community, whether it's the rich history in this country of the beautiful music from Black churches. How do we incorporate that into this rich stream of classical music and create something of beauty that's both that points back to the beauty of our collective past, but is also beautiful in its own way?
Well, we can certainly discuss this and hope for it, and even train people to be adept, at their crafts. Whether it's writing music or painting, beautiful paintings to go into the churches, or sculptors, or makers of stained glass. We can train them, but in order for it to be effective, it has to be wanted, and it has to be wanted by the hierarchy. And so that's where it starts, because I can write the best music possible, and if the pastor won't have it, it's not used. And talented people will find an outlet somewhere, and if they can't find the outlet in the church, then they'll find somewhere else. And unfortunately, that would be to our detriment. Really shame on us for letting that happen. And that's happened, actually. That's how we lost the great composers, because they were no longer wanted. And so they have to be wanted, and they have to feel wanted, and be wanted in fact. And that's by hiring them and letting them produce the music.
Is it difficult, though? I mean, you talk about even trying to build this from the ground up in local parishes. I would assume that, to not only create, but even just to perform some of these beautiful works require a certain amount of resources, not just financially, but talent resources, musicians, singers who could actually take these compositions and perform them in a way that is worthy of liturgy. So is this type of music possible for many communities, parishes that maybe just don't have those resources?
You ask if is it difficult or if it's possible. It's almost impossible. But what a worthy goal. I mean, this is for the worship of God, which is our absolute foremost, prime directive, so to speak. So yes, it's absolutely worth it. Is it a lot of work? Absolutely. Does it take lots of study and pain and practice? Yes, but it is absolutely worth it. I mean, we benefit, of course, but also, if we're worshiping God, then that's reason in itself. But of course, we gain all sorts of benefits along the way.
Well, yeah, it's certainly well said. That comment brings everything back to the absolute reason for everything, God. Both Pope Emeritus Benedict and our current Holy Father, Pope Francis, are both aficionados of classical music. They both have very refined tastes in music. They've both spoken about almost the theological dimensions of music. Benedict called music one of the greatest apologetics that the church has. And I remember reading somewhere of him recounting a story of him, almost moved to tears hearing a performance of Bach. And many Christian philosophers have even proposed the idea of the argument starting from beauty for the existence of God. I think they call it the Mozart argument, that if Mozart's music exists, it's so beautiful that there must be an intelligent God and an order for the universe. Do you agree with that idea that beauty is itself an apologetic, that beauty itself, and in this case, particularly beautiful music, is a way of pointing to the reality of God?
Absolutely. I mean, we certainly first hear it in the Psalms. The heavens declare the glory of God. I mean, the creation is good. We hear that God Himself said that it was good. So there all of these gifts that have been given to us to use, and to use our talents, for this worship is a thing that's actually built Western civilization. When you think of the various towns competing to build one great cathedral, and then the other town sees what this town did, and so they build an even greater one. That sense of healthy, I wouldn't say competition, but healthy participation is something that I think should be encouraged. We had these rival courts, trying to have the best composers, trying to have the best performers. I think we've lost a sense of this diocese, looking at the other dioceses, like, well, they have, this great person here. Let's get someone, let's find the next great person. I'm not sure that's even on the minds of any of our leaders.
And again, all of that effort was to take the best of humanity, the best of our talents, the best of our resources, to praise God. I mean, as you said, many of these great works of classical music were essentially religious pieces of music. Right here in New York, people line up, and I'm sure the same thing in museums in Chicago, to go see great works of art. And the vast majority of these great works of art were devotional works of art. Speaking of paintings, we were here at the Sheen Center before we had to close down temporarily for the pandemic. We were privileged to have an event with Dr. Elizabeth Lev, who's a Rome-based art historian. And we were talking about her book, which was entitled How Catholic Art Saved the Faith. And the premise of the book was how throughout church history, the great visual works of art, painters, sculptors, were critical to building culture, but also sustaining culture throughout periods of internal or external challenges. Would you say, I mean, you kind of referenced that between, many of the medieval towns, having these great works of art created. Would you say that music was just as essential as the visual arts in sustaining that Catholic culture throughout the history of the church?
The musical works that were created actually, I should say the artistic works that were created, the painting, the sculpture, the architecture, those pieces were created certainly at the same time, and in places to house this music. The Bernini statue was sculpted, and great music was sung in the same room. So these pieces come from the same place. Actually, they all come from the same place and the same idea. And toward the same goal. So absolutely, they're kind of one and the same. Really, they're one gesture.
That's an interesting way to think about it. And again, I guess that's what, in many ways, has been lost. How do we get back to that one idea where everything, all our talents are directed towards that shared goal of ad majorem Dei gloria, the greater glory of God. Many contemporary artists, getting back to maybe just classical music for a moment, many contemporary artists in other genres, whether it's jazz or pop or hip hop, or I'm not sure about country, but I'm sure even country, are classically trained musicians. Are there any artists beyond the genre of classical music that you admire and enjoy listening to?
Absolutely. I enjoy some of the current popular music, particularly hip hop. Unfortunately, a lot of the lyrics aren't very edifying, but I have to say, the rhythm, sometimes if there's melody, and often they are coupled with melody, the hip hop pieces are very clever rhythmically, and even the poetry is very clever, even if sometimes the subject matter is a little less for daylight hour.
You mentioned before the idea of young musical artists being drawn to classical music. From your vantage point, what is the landscape like? Or do you notice many gifted musicians gravitating towards classical music? I think back, which is a little bit before my time, but I remember, seeing old recordings of the work that Leonard Bernstein used to do on public television to introduce school children to classical music and kind of break it down to something that was understandable for them. Do you see that next generation coming in? And if you don't, is it because it's not really, there's not a priority there in education to expose children to that?
I do see it. As I mentioned earlier, it is a small group, but not any less important for its size, and very dedicated, actually, and extremely energetic and smart, I would say. These are young people that are interested in church art and church history, and actually interested in being faithful, which is amazing as well. You know, it's refreshing. There's a workshop that I participate in, that I teach at, called the Symposium in Los Angeles, sponsored by the FSSP. And every year you see young people coming in for the composer workshop, incredibly talented, and they combine that with just a freshness of, you know, personality. I mean, they're not weird, and just you know, just normal in the best sense of that word. Just young people, just on fire with the faith, and also with a love of creating beauty for the church, and that's extremely refreshing. And you see just a new crop of them every year. It's wow. Wonderful.
That is heartening and hopeful. You mentioned composing there. I wanted to ask you, because I know in addition to composing, you're also a very accomplished conductor. Do you prefer one? Is there a different enjoyment that you get out of them?
Well, the art, the process of composition is extremely enjoyable. I enjoy sitting down, you know, to that blank page, and beginning, you know, a new piece. It's such a wonderful, I guess, as I said, enjoyable, just a fun process. Working out problems, giving myself problems to solve. It's the process is almost as rewarding as the performance, and sometimes more rewarding, more enjoyable. But as far as conducting, I do enjoy conducting certain pieces more than others. You know, you have to oftentimes, you know, provide variety, and I find that there have been times where I enjoy conducting my pieces more than others, but lately I've been really enjoying conducting my own work, so that's kind of nice.
What you forget about it, and particularly now in this, you know, this time of the pandemic, where, you know, obviously live performances are not an option for safety reasons, that you always think of musical as something ethereal. You forget that sound actually has a real physical presence, almost, that when you're in a space and you hear a live orchestra, you feel the music, not just hear it. And what comes to my background is in film, and I'm a big fan of film scores. And I was really curious in asking you, you know, one of my favorite composers is John Williams. And do you think the ascendancy and the popularity of these symphonic film scores has helped, you know, introduce indirectly new audiences to classical music, just because of the popularity of that symphonic sound?
Yeah, no doubt that genre is quite popular. I don't think that it can accomplish that crossover goal that you mentioned. I think what's more effective, believe it or not, are those Looney Tunes, those old buck bands. Those, because you have in miniature, you know, the real pieces.
Yeah.
And so many people, if they happen to a concert hall or you know, happen to go to a free concert, they'll think, oh my goodness, I know this piece, and they'll remember it, you know, from their childhood. And I think those film scores, while very popular and often very good, are not really the same thing. It's really a subgenre. And actually, I was a little disappointed that now, instead of exploring, you know, new serious music, a lot of the major symphony orchestras are now doing live concerts. Yeah. Yes. You know, and I remember walking by, you know, on Michigan Avenue, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and I saw, you know, oh, I won't mention the movie, and I just rolled my eyes and go, oh dear, if it's not Beethoven, it's this. So let's have something in between.
So in a way, while it can certainly prime the pump for classical music, there's a danger of it almost, for lack of a better word, almost cheapening the appreciation of what a true classical piece of music can accomplish.
Well said.
Sure. Speaking of movies, I'm going to ask you a question that I actually asked. I had the privilege of, over the summer, interviewing Harry Connick Jr., who's obviously a very accomplished musician in his own right. And was asking him about the movie Chariots of Fire, which had obviously a very famous film score. And in that film, the character Eric Liddell, who is one of the Olympic hopeful runners, but who also has a further aspiration of being a Christian missionary, is asked about his faith and his athletic prowess. And the quote, which is one of my favorite film quotes, he says, "I believe that God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." When you're composing, when you're conducting, obviously you're a very, like Harry Connick, he was very humble in his response because you don't want to get too puffed up. But when you're doing what you feel the Lord created you to do, do you feel that pleasure? I mean, do you ever get that sense that when you're conducting, when you're composing, that I think I'm doing what I was created to do here?
You did ask me the question, and I'll give you the answer. And it may seem unbelievable, but it happens for me all the time. I mean, almost every time. Certainly when I'm composing music, I am aware of that fact, of the gift, of what's given to me, and acutely aware and very grateful for it. But also when conducting as well, whether it's some other great piece, conducted so much great music this Holy Week and in Easter. I mean, just glorious piece after another. Some of my pieces included in that repertoire of Holy Week, and all throughout, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how great is this? Being this beautiful church conducting this music with these amazing singers. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. So I can say yes, and all the time. Wow.
Well, I think that's well said. I had referenced Sir James McMillan earlier, and he said something interesting in one interview. He said that even when you're talking to non-believers or people who I would self-identify themselves as searchers, he says they often use the word spiritual when talking about a musical experience. And he suggests that music can be an agent for healing, for finding some commonality among our pluralistic community. And he has a quote, so I just want to read this quote out, and I just want to hear what your thoughts might be. He says, quote, "It's worth remembering this in a time of social and ideological division. No cause is worth it if it destroys the bonds that bind man to man. And perhaps music is the perfect art form to bring people together to see a better world." Do you agree? I mean, obviously, no one would deny the fact that, sadly, tragically, we're in an increasingly polarized and divided world. But do you think music could offer sort of that healing balm? I mean, obviously, the only solution is God's grace and God's love. But do you think music could be part of the solution, part of that language that we could also share as a universal language?
I think objectively, of course it could. It would definitely depend on context. Context is huge because there's a lot of music out there. I mean, there's a lot of powerful art forms out there. And as I said earlier, they're working at opposite goals. And so depending on which,
sure,
group that you're with, if that music is affirming or if it's negating. Saying
that reminds me, there's a great story of the French novelist Paul Claudel, who had been struggling with conversion. And if I remember it correctly, he had sort of assented to all the intellectual arguments, but he said it wasn't until he walked into the Cathedral of Notre Dame and he saw the beautiful rose window with the sunlight coming through it, that he had this aha moment where he said everything then made sense. And through that experience of beauty, he had an experience of the divine. And that's for him when everything sort of snapped into place. Well, I could certainly speak to you for a lot longer than an hour, but you're a very busy man, and I want to be respectful of your time. And before we let you go, just one last question, and kind of where we started. What would your parting words be to to folks, whether they're young and considering a calling to music, specifically classical music or liturgical music, or just, an average person out there who wants to deepen their appreciation for this beautiful patrimony of music, and even the new compositions that are deepening and widening that shared treasury of music that we have as a human family. What would your words be to them as far as why it's important, why it's still relevant, why it is for them? It matters, and it should matter for them.
What I would say to them is to be open, to search, and make it very close. Find someone in your family, find someone in your church, or in your community or your school. Ask them their experiences. Ask them, what do they know about this music? If they've ever known anything about this music, go to your church organist and ask, what their favorite pieces are, and get into a conversation. I find that sometimes, I remember talking to a woman, and she was commenting on how beautiful the choir sang, at the Mass. And she said, she remembers, when she was a girl, and I know she asked her mother, about singing, and she told her about her high school, experiences. And that's something that just would not have happened had she not, made that initial comment. So I think, just searching, and it could be someone in your own house. You'd be amazed at how that will open a door to your exploration of classical music.
And it's not just for the scholarly. I mean, everyone from every background, wherever you are, could probably, enrich their lives by sort of cultivating a little appreciation for this beautiful music that is really everyone's patrimony, that is there for everyone.
That's exactly what I mean. It's exactly that thing. Don't necessarily go for that to the expert, because I think it'll be more powerful if it's someone really just speaking from the heart, because that's the best place to begin.
Sure. And if all else fails, I guess you could watch Bugs Bunny and you could hear some of that music there.
Highly recommended.
Before, I want, if you could just hold on for a few moments, we have one more special treat. We have one more of your pieces. And then if we could just come back and wrap everything up. But it would be a shame if we didn't share this one other beautiful piece. And we'll be right back after that. It's just magnificent. It's so beautiful. Kevin, thank you for sharing your time with us today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your music. But most of all, thank you for your ministry of beauty and for everything you do for the greater glory of God. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to spend this time with you.
You're welcome, David. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you to our viewers for sharing this time with us. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I ask you to please consider liking us on Facebook, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and clicking the bell icon if you want future notifications. And if you are able, I ask you to consider making a donation to the Sheen Center during these challenging times. Every bit, every gift certainly helps. So for a full listing of our Sheen Center events, you can visit us at sheencenter.org. And until next time, stay safe, be well, God bless.